Hi everyone. This is an instructional video on close reading in the archives, which will prepare you for the work that you're going to be doing in Project 3. You may recall that we began reading Elizabeth Winthrop's Counting on Grace together. Counting on Grace is a young adult historical fiction novel that Winthrop wrote after going to an archival exhibit at the Bennington Museum in Vermont. She writes of the photograph that's at the front of the novel. She leans on her spinning frame, staring out at the camera, dressed in a filthy smock. Her one pocket is stuffed full. Her left arm rests easily on the frame, but bent at a strange angle, as if perhaps a bone had been broken and was never set properly. Her bare feet, planted firmly, are slick with grease. She looks directly at you, her eyes wide open and solemn. Her expression resigned, a little wary. She is beautiful. Addie, who is the real name of the girl in the photograph, but Grace is the name that Winthrop gives her protagonist in the novel, is just one of an exhibit of child labor photographs that were taken by Lewis Hine in northern New England. And he scribbled a note in his pocket underneath it that read, "Anemic little spinner in North Pownell Cotton Mill, 1910. Winthrop writes, "I saw Addie's face. I never forgot it. My character, Grace Faussier, was inspired by that face." In your discussion board this week, I ask you to think about close reading first with text. We're going to talk about close reading photographs and other visual artifacts in a moment, but I want us to start with text because I think that this is what we're most familiar with from high school English classes, perhaps a literature class that you took in college, and maybe a composition class as well. So think a minute about what does close reading mean to you? Of course, in one of the videos that I asked you to look at during the, to prepare for the discussion board, there's this funny kind of piece where the young woman who is moderating puts the book on her face and says that's a close reading, right? But close reading is when we go deep into a text and we often find one quote, one scene, something that gets us into the text first, and we think about its significance overall. I often think about these three questions. What does the text say? What does it mean? And what is the significance of that meaning? If I were to do this discussion board post, I might pull out that last sentence at the end of chapter 1 that we read together on the Thursday before spring break. Here, Grace writes in first person, "All I can think of in that minute is what she called me, another one of her best readers, me, of all people." Now, of course, when I describe what's happened before or after this quote, her analysis or her kind of epiphany, the character's epiphany, is shocking here, right? Because she's just been arguing with Miss Leslie that she wants to work in the cotton mills immediately. In fact, she envies that French Johnny came to get Arthur because she wants to go work in the cotton mills to help her family. Every little bit of money helps her family eat, helps her family survive. And so if we think about then point 3 in this bullet list, why is this quote significant to our reading of the text? It gives us insight into Grace and gives us insight into the context that influenced her thinking about child labor between 1900 and 1920, thinking about living where she lived in a rural situation where her family was completely dependent on the money that they received from the cotton mills. And it also helps us think a little bit about the character herself, that on the one hand, even though she realizes that she doesn't have a lot of choices like Arthur, on the other hand, she is it's really important to her what Miss Leslie says about that she's one of the best readers. It's something that she never thought about in terms of her identity, and she's holding on to that really closely. The picture of Addie that Elizabeth Winthrop used for her novel's inspiration is one of many photographs that Lewis Hine photographed during essentially the early 1900s. He was primarily doing this in a response to child labor concerns. Let's take a moment to watch this short film. And right before we do so, I want to also point out at the bottom of the screen, underneath the link to the short film, you can read more about Hine and his work, child labor laws, and teaching with his photographs in the National Archives. In week 12, we're going to revisit our course guide for English 303. And there are resources in that guide for both the National Archives and the Library of Congress that provide teaching tools, often materials that are already put together, such as the Library of Congress has lesson plans for teaching archival materials that often are by grade level or by a state standard. And so these resources are available to you as well as you start thinking about teaching with special collections and archives. So let's take a moment and watch this video. If it does not work for you, you can use the link that I have provided in this slide.
There was no one.
Children are just so little. The machines are so big. The children working in coal mines were 7 and 8 years old, and they worked in the dark. The newsies were the newsboys, and occasionally newsgirls, sold newspapers on the street, and lives of their life. The newsies, of course, were also exploited child laborers. It was their newspapers as much as they were persuading legislators to change the law. If you'd like to peruse some of his other photographs that are collected with the National Child Labor Committee collection in the Library of Congress, here's a link, and you can see that there are 52 pages, or more than 52 pages, 5,132 photographs. Not all of these were taken by Louis Hine, but it'll show you the kinds of things that are in this collection. I want to take a closer look at this photograph from the collection. We know a little more about it because of Hine's notes. Oftentimes when you find a photograph or a manuscript in an archive, there isn't as much information. So this is kind of the anomaly, but much of this is recorded again because it was for a specific initiative. So this is a picture of Sadie Pfeiffer, and it's from Lancaster, South Carolina, a mill, cotton mill that she worked in, and it was taken, we know, November 30th, 1908. Take a moment and look at it closely and think about what you see in the photograph. So there's a handout that I'm going to be asking you to kind of work through, which is close reading visual artifacts. And you'll be looking at a photograph of your own this week or another visual artifact from the EKU Special Collections and Archives. But for now, I kind of want to walk through and practice the kinds of questions and the kinds of things you should be thinking about with these questions. Normally in a face-to-face class, we would do this with a partner and kind of work through. I have multiple examples of these photos on paper copy, and the reason I tell you this is because I'm also going to kind of move between my professor hat and my what would I do in my classroom if I was teaching K-12 hat in this segment of the video. So let's practice looking at this photograph, and let's just go through some of these questions. So the first one is, what do you notice first? What people and objects are shown? How are they arranged? What, if any, words do you see? What's happening in the image? Now immediately I'm thinking about the film we just watched and the kind of size comparison, that proportion, right? We've got little Sadie and we've got someone who looks a little bit older on the other end of the, I think those are called bobbins, but she is just outweighed by proportionately the equipment that she's having to work on. And if you think about it, both people look pretty small compared to the machinery. And there are only two people on this line. There's no words. And what we can see happening in the image is, of course, her fingers are working through something on the machinery, and it is a factory kind of setting. Also, you may notice that the walls look like they're really plain, institutional. There looks like there's natural light and lots of windows, and also light bulbs maybe hanging down in the background and maybe in the foreground, and we can't see that in the photograph for lighting maybe later in the day. But we don't see a lot of, there's wooden floors. It doesn't look like there's a place to sit down and rest or anything like that. The second question asks us, where do you think that the photograph was taken? What was the physical setting? Now, of course, we know this because there's information from the image, but there may be some times that you cannot find that information and you'll have to think about the setting. For instance, you might not know what's in South Carolina, but clearly this is a cotton mill or some kind of industrial setting. The third question says, what is the first modality of production for this visual artifact? Or what kinds of technology produced it? To what extent does this affect the truthfulness of the image? So we know, of course, that this was a photograph, and so that's what that means, modality of production. This was taken by a camera. Of course, cameras in the early 20th century are quite different than our iPhones now, and so you can see that he would have had to set up large equipment. If we think about old-fashioned pictures of cameras that often are on like tripods, or even if it was mobile, it would have been heavier equipment. And so thinking about that, you can't really take the instantaneous pictures or the multiple shots that we can with an iPhone. You would have had to stage this to some extent. The figures in the photograph would know that they're being photographed versus some of our photographing today. Sometimes you can be in a photograph and not realize it in the moment. So to what extent does this affect the truthfulness of the image? Think about the implications of that just for a moment. The fourth question, why do you think this image was made? When do you think it was made? What context? And this is really important because you're going to be looking at this for your image that you choose for Project 3, your artifact. What context, social, historical, and/or political, contributed to the production of this photograph? Again, we have a lot of information just because Louis Hine is famous for his child labor photographs as well as other photographs as we learned in the film. And so I'm going to read to you directly from some information in the National Archives link about his work that I pointed out in a previous slide. It reads, the number of children under the age of 15 who worked in industrial jobs for wages climbed from 1.5 million in 1890 to 2 million by 1910. So think about when this photograph was taken, 1908. In 1904, a group of progressive reformers founded the National Child Labor Committee, which was an organization whose goal was the abolition of child labor. This organization received a charter from Congress in 1907 and hired teams of investigators to gather evidence of children working in harsh conditions, and then organized exhibitions with photographs and statistics to dramatize the plight of these children. These efforts resulted in the establishment in 1912 of the Children's Bureau of the Federal Information Clearinghouse, which was transferred to the Department of Labor by 1913. In 1916, Congress passed the Keating-Owens Act that established the following child labor standards: a minimum age of 14 for workers in manufacturing, 16 in mining, a maximum workday of 8 hours, prohibition of night work for workers under 16, and documented proof of age. Although, of course, we know from reading Winthrop's piece that that could be fudged at times, that documentation of age. Unfortunately, this law was later ruled unconstitutional on the ground that congressional power to regulate interstate commerce did not extend to the conditions of labor. Effective action against child labor had to wait until the New Deal, so we're thinking Franklin Roosevelt in the 1920s. Reformers, however, did succeed in forcing legislation at the state level banning child labor and setting maximum hours. By 1920, the number of child laborers that was cut from nearly half of what it had been in 1910. So I'm immediately thinking about social media campaigns today, right, and connections there. What Louis Hine did that was more effective really than writing the articles about child labor was showing what child labor looked like and showing how young the children were and in different kind of work environments so that there could be reform. So the next question on this handout that you'll be working through later asks you to imagine a 4-quadrant grid to analyze the formal components of the photograph. So when I bring this into class, what I do is I use those page savers, those clear, they're like a clear kind of envelope almost that you can slip a paper into. You may have used them in high school. You may use them now for other important papers that you don't want to tear easily. And they have 3 holes on the side so you can slip them into a binder. So I print off these photographs without any information because I want students to think about it without the information. And I slip them into one of these page savers. And then on top of the page saver, I use a Sharpie pen to draw this quadrant, the black lines. So I've done it electronically here, but you get the idea. Here are the questions to kind of think about. What is pictured in each quadrant? So let's start by looking at the top left quadrant. We see only the bobbins and the cotton material, and then we also can see kind of maybe how it's being powered from the ceiling, the mechanism of it. The right hand top quadrant, we get the heads of the figures of both the woman or child who looks older than Sadie in the front, and then Sadie kind of in the foreground. We just get the top part of her. We can see that her hair is kind of tied back a little bit and shorter. Of course, we read in Winthrop's novel that Grace's sister is warning her to keep her hair back so you don't get it caught in the machinery. We can also see those windows again that we talked about, and the industrial looking walls and the hardwood floors. It doesn't look particularly clean, and so we get that sense from that. Then if we go down into the right hand side quadrant, we see in the foreground here, it's kind of blurred out, but some kind of mechanism, maybe it's what's powering the wires at the top, I'm not quite sure. We get a better sense of what Sadie is wearing, this long skirt, her pocket looks torn, her clothes look that they haven't been clean, they have gotten perhaps grease or something like that from the factory. We see that she does have shoes and socks or stockings on. A lot of these photographs, in a lot of them, the children don't have shoes, which is another kind of danger factor to think about. We can see how small her arm and hands are and how she's pushing her fingers in between these bobbins. And then, of course, the left bottom quadrant kind of working around clockwise. We see the machinery, which is kind of blurred out in the photographs, so that we see Sadie and the person behind her are clear, but then the machinery itself, which again looms just so large compared to Sadie and the other person in the photograph, is kind of blurred out in the foreground here. Also, just think about the fact that Sadie is not centered in the photograph, right? Oftentimes, like when someone is the subject, sometimes particularly amateur photographers like me, I will try to center the person in the photograph, but she's not the center. The machinery takes up about half of the photograph, a good half of the photograph, right? Whereas the people take up less than that in terms of proportion of what's in that photograph. So some of the other questions to think about that I just kind of worked through with you: how do these elements work separately, collectively? Which subjects are photographed more prominently than others? How are elements of the photographs arranged? And what does this arrangement tell us? That last question should sound familiar. It's very similar to when we were looking at close readings of Counting on Grace, right, which is a written text. A photograph is a visual text. They're both texts, and the elements for close reading are similar. So one of the last questions is Jillian Rose, who is the scholar that a lot of these questions that I created on this handout are developed from, argues that, quote, the site of audiencing, or where images, meanings are made, there should be an apostrophe there, I'm sorry, refers to the process by which a visual image has its meaning renegotiated or even rejected by particular audiences watching in specific circumstances. And the question is, what can we surmise about the intended audience for this photograph? And if someone made this today, what would be different or what would be similar? Again, I've pulled some information from the article that I point out to you from the National Archives. Of course, you'll be researching and being able to describe your photograph with research as well. So Louis Hine was a New York City school teacher and a photographer. So he was a teacher like y'all. And he believed that a picture could tell a powerful story. He felt so strongly about the abuse of children as workers that he quit his teaching job and became one of the investigative photographers for the National Child Labor Committee. He traveled around the country photographing the working conditions of children in all types of industries and took pictures of children working in the streets as shoe shiners, newsboys, and hawkers. In many instances, he tricked his way into the factories One of the stories is often that he was he would pretend to be a Bible salesman, or he would have to, as the video talked about, quickly make connections with children so he could get the pictures before he was discovered who he was and what he was doing. He was careful to document every photograph with precise facts and figures, and to obtain captions for his pictures, he interviewed the children on some pretext and then scribbled his notes with his hand hidden inside his pocket. He took his photographs. He believed that he had to be double sure that the photo data was 100% pure, and he did not retouch the photographs in any way. He defined a good photograph as a reproduction of impressions made upon the photographer, which he desires to repeat to others. So think about, he's not arguing here that this is exactly real life. He's arguing here that this is real life, a reproduction of real life, if you will, that includes impressions of what he wants to convey to an audience. He realized his photographs were subjective and described his work as photo interpretation. So the last question is, after reading this photograph closely, what do you still wonder about? Finally, I want to end with talking about why we do this at all. Even before we had interdisciplinary literacy practices, which I think are really important, but they were instated in the summer of 2019. One might argue, okay, well, working with archives is something you do in social studies. It's not something you do in English language arts or ELA. But I would argue that reading photographs, and we've talked about this some in class, actually helps to bridge between students. Think about our use of children's literature that some of you talked about in your projects. It helps to bridge between struggling readers and readers who are more comfortable with reading at different levels. The other reason that I like to include archives is because it connects to my own work. Way before I was at EKU, and something I continue to do, I look at writers who are often marginalized, or sometimes writers who have been included in anthologies often, and I wonder, what is it about those writers, particularly writers that are historically marginalized, like women, for instance, in the 19th century? What is it about those writers that ensured their success throughout time, whereas other writers, perhaps who were published and very popular at that time, had less long-term success or longevity? And last spring, two of the archivists asked me to send in kind of a quote about why I teach in special collections and archives. And this is what I wrote, and here's a copy of it here, but here's the full statement. My impetus for bringing students to the archives developed from a desire to make connections between my research and teaching transparent. EKU's Special Collections and Archives furthers students' connections through holdings that speak to the history of our region. When students examine an artifact, they read for both composition and production, right? So you're doing this negotiation of kind of a reading, like we talked about with Ken Aptegar's photographs before we did our museum visit. When students investigate the context associated with an artifact, they question assumptions to reframe initial readings. And when English education students demonstrate how to teach an artifact, theory informs practice, extending the significance of an artifact story for future generations of students. EKU's Special Collections and Archives invites all of us to consider ways of reading that dissolve disciplinary boundaries and inform our thinking about relationships between time, place, and perspective. So I'm excited for you to get started with Project 3. There's a few more things that you'll be doing in this module, and then by week 12, you'll be moving into your work and your thinking about a selected artifact.